In spring 1942, the front around Kharkov stabilized after the winter counteroffensive. The Red Army held the Izium-Barvenkovo salient on the Seversky Donets, a protrusion created by January-February attacks that crossed the river near Izium and advanced northwest toward Balaklia and Lozova. The salient's base spanned roughly 90 to 100 kilometers along the river. Its depth reached 70 to 80 kilometers toward Kharkov. Soviet formations inside and around it belonged chiefly to the Southwestern Front, commanded by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, with Ivan Bagramyan as chief of staff, and the Southern Front under Rodion Malinovsky along the lower Donets. Opposite them, Army Group South under Fedor von Bock held Kharkov, and the Donets bend with 6th Army, Friedrich Paulus, north of the river, and 1st Panzer Army, Ewald von Kleist, to the south. Kharkov's importance was military and economic, a rail hub linking Kursk-Poltava-Donbass lines and a pre-war industrial center that had provided tanks, tractors, and machine tools. Control of the rail junction and the river crossings promised leverage over supply routes into the Donbass and toward the lower Don. After the Rasputitsa eased, both coal shipments and fuel deliveries could resume in higher volumes, allowing sustained operations. For the Red Army, holding the salient threatened the German flank defending Kharkov. For the Wehrmacht, the salient endangered planned summer operations toward the lower Don and Caucasus. By April 1942, Soviet intelligence estimated that Army Group South had suffered winter attrition and rotated several divisions. Stavka assessed that a concentrated attack from the salient and from the north could compress German forces around Kharkov and potentially liberate the city before the Axis regrouped for a summer offensive. Preparations included assembling shock groupings in the salient, notably the 6th and 57th Armies, and massing artillery and bridging assets along the Donets. On the northern shoulder, armies positioned east and northeast of Kharkov were tasked to advance southwest to meet the southern thrust. Aviation from the southwestern and southern fronts was assigned to suppress German airfields around Kharkov and Kupiansk, while engineer units stockpiled pontoon equipment to sustain crossings in case of counterattacks on the river line. German planning took a different direction. In April-May, OKH refined the concept for Case Blue, aiming at the lower Don and the Caucasus oil regions. Before that offensive could start, the Barvenkovo salient had to be neutralized. Paulus prepared defensive belts west and south of Kharkov, with infantry divisions stiffened by panzer reserves, while Kleist positioned mobile corps south of the salient's base near Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Luftflotte, 4 concentrated bomber and reconnaissance units to watch Soviet assembly areas and railheads. German reconnaissance reported Soviet concentration inside the salient and increased traffic across the Donets crossings near Izium and Balaklia. The German response plan combined elastic defense around Kharkov with a counterstroke against the salient's neck once Soviet forces were committed. Command structures on each side were clear. On the Soviet side, Timoshenko directed operations of the Southwestern Front. Bagramyan managed staff work, interfront coordination with Malinovsky, and the timing of supporting attacks from the north. Political oversight came through the military councils attached to the fronts. On the German side, von Bock coordinated Paulus and Kleist. Panzer Corps, under Eberhard von Mackensen and others, stood ready for operational exploitation. Signals intelligence on both sides played a role. German intercepts and aerial reconnaissance tracked Soviet rail movements. Soviet front headquarters compiled prisoner interrogations and pattern analyses of Luftwaffe activity to estimate German reserves. Manpower and equipment reflected different priorities. Soviet armies assigned to the salient and the northern pincer counted multiple rifle divisions with attached tank brigades and independent tank battalions, supported by corps artillery and guards mortar units. Exact strengths varied by division after winter losses and March-April replenishment, but rifle divisions commonly fielded 6,000 to 8,000 personnel and 40 to 60 guns and mortars, with tank brigades averaging several dozen T-34s and T-60. German infantry divisions near Kharkov had reorganized after winter with reduced battalion counts and limited motor transport, while panzer divisions in the sector, preserved the bulk of available mobility, and carried the main counterattack role. Luftwaffe and VVS activity increased with improved weather, enabling deeper reconnaissance and interdiction against railheads at Kupiansk, Lozova, and Walwiki. Civilian conditions affected mobility and intelligence. Evacuation and occupation during 1941 had disrupted population centers around Kharkov, Izium, and the Donetsk towns. Transport assets and fuel were prioritized for military use, straining local supply of food and medical services. Rail repair battalions on both sides worked to restore bridges and sidings damaged in winter fighting. Marshy lowlands along the Donetsk limited armor movement off roads, channeling attacks onto causeways and prepared crossings. Drier high ground around Balaklia and Andreevka offered better maneuver space once May temperatures firmed the soil. Communications and logistics framed operational risk. The Soviet salient relied on a limited set of bridges and ferries over the Donetsk for supply and evacuation. Depots east of the river stocked artillery ammunition and fuel forward to support a short, high-tempo offensive. This created throughput advantages for the initial push, but exposed formations if crossings were interdicted. German defenders around Kharkov used interior rail lines to shuttle reserves between threatened sectors and positioned field depots along lateral roads north and south of the city for rapid redistribution. The Luftwaffe's proximity to major airfields at Kharkov and Poltava supported faster turnaround for reconnaissance and ground attack sorties, while Soviet air units operated from more distant fields east of the Oskol and near Voroshilovgrad, affecting sortie rates until forward strips could be established. Political guidance shaped timing. With the winter successes around Moscow and the stabilization near Leningrad, Soviet leadership sought an operational victory in the south to disrupt the expected German summer push. The decision to attack Kharkov from the Barvenkovo salient and from the north reflected that intent. Stavka's directive sequence in early May defined the date for the opening blow and the distribution of artillery and tank support to the shock armies. The German High Command, in turn, aimed to conserve forces for Case Blue, accepting local counterstrokes only when they promised decisive positional improvement, specifically the elimination of the salient to free mobile units for the larger campaign. By 11 in May 1942, Soviet assault groupings had completed their last rail moves, artillery registered on German forward positions, and bridging trains stood ready behind the Donetsk. On 12th May, the opening phase began. North and south of Kharkov, Soviet units advanced according to plan, pressing German outposts and forcing withdrawals to intermediate lines. As the first gains accumulated, both staffs measured commitment thresholds and reserve counters. The next decisions, how quickly to deepen the thrusts and how long to hold the river crossings under growing pressure, would determine whether the salient served as a springboard or became a liability. At dawn on 12th May 1942, Soviet artillery groups along the Barvenkovo bridgeheads opened fire in a scheduled sequence. Counter-battery missions against identified German guns, then linear barrages to cut wire and stun forward companies, and finally rolling lifts to cover the first echelons. Assault detachments from the 6th Army advanced northwest from the salient's northern face toward Balaklia, while the 57th Army pushed west from the southern face toward Protopopovka and Andreevka. Tank brigades committed in company packets to keep pressure across multiple points followed pre-marked lanes cleared by engineers. On the opposite side of the sector, north of Kharkov, armies positioned east of the city attacked southwest to fix 6th Army and prevent reserves from pivoting against the salient. Initial German resistance relied on outpost screens and flexible withdrawals to secondary trenches mapped before the thaw. Infantry battalions along the Balaklia axis fell back in bounds under cover of mortars and machine guns, ceding villages but preserving unit cohesion. Wehrmacht reports noted increased 5VS activity over the battlefield. Soviet ground attack flights focused on road junctions, feeding German forward companies, while reconnaissance aircraft searched for signs of panzer concentration south of the Donetsk. Luftwaffe elements from fields near Kharkov and Poltava staged counterstrikes against river crossings and assembly areas east of Izium, targeting pontoon parks and ammunition columns. Both air forces reported constraints from limited forward fuel stocks and runways still undergoing repair after winter. By 13th May, Soviet echelons deepened the advance. Rifle divisions compressed local German strongpoints and established fire bases in captured hamlets, positioning regimental guns to sustain movement beyond the first trench belt. Tank brigades exploited gaps toward road spurs leading to Balaklaya. Communications officers prioritized line repairs forward of the Donets to keep divisional nets stable. Radio discipline remained strict to limit direction finding. Artillery directors moved observation posts onto ridgelines north of the river to maintain visual on German fallback lines and to adjust counter-battery fire. Medical evacuation used two-way traffic over the same bridges carrying ammunition and fuel into the salient, highlighting the dependence on a small number of river crossings. Civilian presence around frontline settlements complicated both sides' movement. Evacuations in 1941 had been partial. Some residents remained in basements or makeshift shelters near wells and rail sidings. As positions shifted during the first 48 hours, both commands issued orders limiting requisitioning without staff authorization, but displacement occurred wherever units needed carts or draft animals. Field kitchens and regimental aid posts recorded a flow of locals seeking food or information about relatives east of the river or in German-held Kharkov. Rail repair units west of Kupiansk worked to restore spur lines that could bring ammunition closer to the northern pincer. German demolition parties targeted culverts and small bridges to slow that effort without committing major forces. On 14th to 15th May, pressure north of Kharkov achieved measured gains, but not a decisive rupture. German 6th Army shifted reserves laterally to block approaches to the city's eastern suburbs, employing localized counterattacks to retake tactically valuable knolls and to deny artillery observers line of sight to the Kharkov rail yards. Within the salient, Soviet staffs interpreted the steady westward movement as confirmation that German defenses were thinning. Orders elevated the tempo. Additional tank brigades were fed into narrow corridors where roads and causeways permitted wheeled ammunition carriers to keep pace. The density of units along those axes increased, further tying the operation's tempo to throughput over the Donets bridges and the condition of lateral roads inside the salient. South of the salient's neck, 1st Panzer Army adjusted its posture. Reconnaissance battalions reported Soviet armor moving in brigade strength, but also noted the predictable road usage dictated by the marshy lowlands. Kleist's staff refined a counterstroke plan, hold the immediate front with infantry and anti-tank screens, while concentrating mobile corps near the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk area, masked by terrain and disciplined radio traffic. Luftwaffe reconnaissance sorties shifted to photographing traffic density at the salient's base, counting crossings per hour and vehicle types to estimate supply rates. This analysis supported the German assumption that once Soviet spearheads were fully engaged west of the river, a blow at the neck could cut lines of retreat and supply. Within Soviet headquarters, timing debates focused on commitment of second echelon formations. Bagramyan's planners weighed the need to widen corridors before pushing deeper toward Balaklia against the operational desire to maintain pressure, while German reserves were still in motion. Artillery ammunition expenditure rates climbed. Staff tables showed that if daily allocations remained at the current level, forward depots would require uninterrupted river traffic and favorable weather to avoid pauses. Engineer reports highlighted wear on pontoon equipment from continuous heavy loads and warned that sustained air attacks could disrupt the precise ferry schedules that kept columns moving. Morale and discipline reflected the pressures of movement and attrition. Rifle battalions advancing through mined lanes documented steady casualties among sappers and junior leaders. Yet, unit logs also recorded successful small unit maneuvers around localized resistance, especially where pre-war field boundaries offered covered approaches. German company diaries described measured withdrawals, with platoons regrouping behind anti-tank guns pulled by half-tracks or commandeered tractors. Logistics sections on both sides prioritized recovery of disabled vehicles. Soviet tank brigades salvaged T-30 foes for cannibalization, while German workshops focused on keeping a limited number of panzers operational for immediate counterattacks. By 16th May, the operational picture clarified. Soviet spearheads stood closer to Balaklia and held villages that served as firing points onto German lateral roads. However, lateral expansion lagged behind depth, and several corridors remained narrow. Weather stabilized, improving road-bearing capacity, but also enabling heavier Luftwaffe sorties against the Donetsk bridges and park areas east of Izium. Bridge guards reported repeated attacks with bombs and low-level strafing. Repair teams kept crossings open, but traffic control imposed longer intervals between columns, elongating resupply cycles. German command assessed that the moment to engage at the salient's base was approaching. Reserve panzer and motorized formations moved into assembly woods south of the Donets, with orders to strike north and northeast, to meet at designated points behind Soviet forward echelons. Infantry regiments along the Balaklia Arc received instructions to maintain contact, but avoid decisive counterattacks that could draw mobile units away from the planned concentration. Signals units rehearsed deception measures to suggest preparations for a counterblow north of Kharkov, hoping to freeze Soviet northern pincer reserves in place. On the evening of May 16th, Soviet front headquarters reviewed situation maps. Advances were measurable, German counterattacks localized, and air attacks on crossings significant but not yet decisive. The decision for the next 48 hours was whether to commit additional armor to deepen the thrust toward Balaklia and attempt envelopment of German positions east of the city, or to pause briefly to broaden the corridors and reinforce the neck of the salient against a possible counterstroke. The choice would determine how the gains of the opening phase translated into either operational consolidation or exposure of the entire grouping west of the Donets. Operational design on the Soviet side defined two converging efforts against Kharkov. From the Barvenkovo salient, shock groupings would move on Balaklia and the rail approaches east of the city. From the north and northeast, armies would press southwest toward the same junctions. The intended meeting line lay on a belt of rail spurs and highways controlling access to Kharkov's yards, with secondary goals of pushing the Germans off the Donets crossings between Chuguyev and Staryi Saltiv. The plan allocated artillery and tank support to produce a breakthrough at multiple points rather than a single Schwerpunkt, aiming to overload German lateral reserves. Command posts forward of Izium and on the northern pincer coordinated with daily situation reports to Stavka, which monitored supply and tempo indicators, daily bridge throughput, artillery ammunition expenditure, and average rates of advance. Force composition reflected recent replenishment patterns. Rifle divisions carried complement levels adjusted after winter, below tables of organization, but stabilized by March drafts. Tank brigades attached to the shock groupings fielded mixed companies of T-34s and T-60. Battalion logs listed fuel allocations sized for several days of continuous movement if resupply across the Donets held. Artillery groupings combined core guns, howitzers, and guards mortars to perform counter-battery and interdiction against German road nodes. Engineer units staffed the Donets bridges with 24-hour maintenance details and constructed secondary ferries to relieve congestion during peak resupply windows. Staff calculations assumed that German forces around Kharkov would prioritize holding the city's approaches and would hesitate to strip reserves from the urban perimeter. The salient's internal road network, though narrow, would suffice to move second echelons once the foremost corridors widened. Risk notes in front headquarters files acknowledged the vulnerability of the salient's base, yet planners judged that the concentration of Soviet armies and artillery on the forward faces, combined with fixing attacks north of the city, would delay any major German counterstroke at the neck until after Soviet spearheads had seized the Balaklia road hub. German operational goals were broader than the immediate defense of Kharkov. The elimination of the Barvenkovo salient promised to straighten the front before the planned summer offensive toward the lower Don and the Caucasus. Staff work under Army Group South treated local defense and counterattack as parts of a single scheme, trade ground in front of Kharkov while preparing a blow from the south against the salient's neck. Mobile formations, panzer and motorized divisions were held in depth near Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Infantry divisions along the salient's northern arc maintained contact and delayed advances with prepared withdrawals. Air reconnaissance counted columns at the Donets crossings and photographed dumps east of Izium to estimate daily Soviet tonnage flow. Logistics officers mapped Soviet bridge schedules and sought to predict the hours when traffic density would be highest, guiding Luftflotte 4 to concentrate strikes that could produce compounding delays. Doctrinal habits shaped both plans. The Red Army emphasized simultaneous pressure along a broad front, using artillery to erode resistance and tanks to force local gaps that rifle units would enlarge. Control relied on prearranged fire plans and phase lines, with radios supplementing lines where possible. The Wehrmacht, constrained by manpower but retaining mobile reserves, aimed for elasticity. Local withdrawals to secondary positions, coupled with counterattacks by concentrated armor at decisive points. In this sector, the decisive point was defined not as a village or hill, but the supply neck of the salient and its river crossings. Supply and transport framed the operation's limits. On the Soviet side, railheads at Kupiansk and Valuiki fed motor columns to Izium and the bridge parks. Fuel and artillery shells crossed over limited bridging, then moved along a few lateral roads inside the salient. Staff tables measured daily needs in truckloads by division and recorded backlogs whenever air attacks forced longer intervals between convoys. On the German side, interior lines allowed shifting of anti-tank assets and artillery around Kharkov. Panzer units in depth consumed fuel at lower rates while waiting, preserving operational reach for a short, high-tempo counterstroke. Luftwaffe depots at Kharkov and Poltava staged bombs and fuel for repeated sorties against crossings and road junctions. Intelligence assessments on both sides contained uncertainties. Soviet reconnaissance teams reported German infantry thinning in forward positions and noted only limited armor sightings near the city, reinforcing the sense that the main threat lay in local counterattacks rather than a large maneuver from the south. German intercepts and prisoner statements pointed to increased Soviet traffic into the salient and higher densities of artillery around Balaklia, confirming the offensive intent, but leaving open whether the northern pincer could be frozen by feints. Both staffs understood the constraint of terrain. Marshy zones along the Donets and limited causeways funneled movement. Rising May temperatures improved road-bearing capacity, but did not eliminate bottlenecks. Political direction influenced tempo. Soviet leadership expected an operational success before the German summer campaign began, and reports of progress in the first days sustained pressure to continue deepening the advance. German high command sought to avoid costly static battles near Kharkov that could degrade mobile forces planned for the next phase of the war. Eliminating the salient would restore freedom of action and release units for the southward drive. Propaganda organs on each side tracked the fighting, but emphasized different themes. The Red Army highlighted village captures and ground gained. German communiques emphasized orderly withdrawals, successful local counterattacks, and airstrikes on bridges. Miscalculation risks were documented in staff notes, though weighted differently. Soviet planners recorded the danger of excessive depth without sufficient breadth, narrow corridors increasing the load on a few roads, and facilitating enemy interdiction. They also noted that if the Donets crossings suffered prolonged closure, medical evacuation and ammunition resupply would degrade simultaneously. German planners recorded the possibility that a mistimed counterstroke could expose mobile formations to concentrated artillery and tank attacks, while Soviet spearheads still had room to maneuver within the salient. By 17th May, both sides had converged on their next decisions. In the Soviet camp, orders emphasized maintaining forward momentum toward Balaklia while assigning additional engineers to strengthen the salient's base. Ammunition allocations for corps artillery were adjusted to sustain counter-battery against German guns suspected of masking a buildup south of the river. In the German camp, Mobile Corps received final movement tables to assembly woods covering the approach routes north and northeast, with synchronization points designed to meet behind the Soviet forward echelons. Infantry on the northern arc were instructed to avoid engagements that could pin the armor. Air operations were synchronized with ground movements. The VVS planned fighter sweeps to protect crossings during peak traffic windows, and ground attack missions against German road nodes east of Kharkov. The Luftwaffe scheduled reconnaissance at dawn and dusk to detect changes in column density at the bridges and concentrated bombers on spans identified as most critical. Both sides allocated night sorties to harassment and interdiction of repair teams, seeking incremental effects that would accumulate over the next 24 to 48 hours. The final staff maps drawn on the evening of May 17th showed Soviet spearheads closer to Balaklia, German forward lines adjusted but intact, and traffic graphs at the Donets edging toward the limits of safe throughput. Commanders on each side confirmed their next moves, push depth versus strike at the neck. In the early hours of May 18th, south of the salient's base, German mobile formations began to roll toward their start lines, while Soviet bridge guards tightened schedules to maintain the flow across the river that sustained all units west of it. Before dawn on May 18th, the pattern of the first week had settled into a measured exchange. Soviet echelons pushed along narrow axes toward Balaklia and the Chuhuiv approaches, while German infantry yielded tactically unfavorable ground and reoccupied prepared lines behind anti-tank guns and minefields. The tempo depended on artillery ammunition arriving across the Donets and on bridge availability. Staff plots from Soviet front headquarters showed daily advances measured in kilometers, with local penetrations of several trench belts, but incomplete control of the lateral roads needed to widen the corridors. German situation reports recorded platoon and company withdrawals, executed under mortar cover, followed by short counterattacks to disrupt Soviet artillery observation posts. Village-scale engagements characterized 12 to 17 May. On the northern face of the salient, rifle regiments fought across hedgerows and field boundaries to occupied line-of-sight points overlooking the Balaklia Road. Regimental guns were brought forward to suppress machine gun nests in schoolhouses, barns, and brickworks. Tank brigades worked in packets of 10 to 20 vehicles, entering at pre-cleared mine gaps and halting to engage at 600 to 800 meters where visibility allowed. German defenders employed 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns, sighted in depth and shifted by night to avoid pre-registered fires. The pattern of fire revealed to both sides the constraints of the ground. Armor could not bypass on marshy approaches, and wheeled ammunition carriers were tied to causeways. Air action increased each day the weather held. VVS fighter sweeps covered peak bridge traffic windows and attempted to hold Luftwaffe attack aircraft beyond the Donets. Ground attack sorties struck German road junctions and suspected gun areas east of Kharkov, aiming to reduce the tempo of lateral troop movements. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographed bridge approaches at Izium and pontoon parks concealed under camouflage nets. Bombers returned at dusk to crater access roads and disrupt repair teams. Both air forces reported attrition in pilots and machines consistent with sustained operations, with losses recorded in single digits per day per side during the first week, but cumulative effects visible in sortie rates. By 16th to 17th May, several local Soviet gains appeared promising. Map symbols indicated footholds on ridges that dominated feeder roads into Balaklia, and forward observers reported German traffic rerouting to more distant spurs. However, traffic counts at the Donets bridges reached saturation. Columns of fuel and ammunition alternated with medical evacuation, and any air-induced closure forced cascading delays. Engineer reports noted wear on pontoons and repeated patching of anchor points. The staff solution was to tighten convoy scheduling and to hold rear area reserves ready to surge across at night when air activity ebbed. German forward units assessed that the Soviet assault groupings remained concentrated along predictable corridors. Company diaries mentioned hearing tracked movement at night, confined to the same lanes used on previous days, a sign that engineers had not yet established additional crossing points over streams inside the salient. At the same time, prisoner interrogations and intercepted transmissions suggested that Soviet higher echelons were still committing tank brigades forward, rather than holding them to secure the salient's neck. For German planners, this confirmed that the opportunity for a strike at the base of the salient would expand as more Soviet formations crossed west of the Donets. Civilian impact in the early engagements reflected the shifting front. Populations in hamlets along the axes experienced requisitioning of draft animals, relocation to cellars during barrages, and interruptions of water supply when wells fell within line of fire zones. Field medical services documented cases of civilian casualties from mines and unexploded ordnance. Both commands issued orders for marked lanes warnings, though adherence varied under fire. Rail workers east of the river maintained sidings and turnouts to move rolling stock closer to forward dumps, while German demolition teams targeted culverts to impose repeated repair tasks without committing significant forces. Unexpected outcomes emerged from the interaction of logistics and terrain. Soviet rifle divisions that advanced deepest reported that their supply echelons struggled to keep pace along overused roads inside the salient. Where lateral expansion lagged, a single stalled vehicle could block movement until recovery crews arrived. Conversely, German units noted that some secondary positions prepared in April proved vulnerable to observed artillery fire from Soviet-held ridgelines. These positions were abandoned after daylight registration revealed their coordinates. Both sides adapted. Soviet staff officers emphasized the need to broaden corridors before further depth, and German company commanders increased the use of decoy positions and dispersed command posts. The presence and absence of armor influenced morale differently on each front. Soviet units took confidence from the arrival of tanks to clear strongpoints, but recorded higher fuel consumption than planned when repeated short moves were required. German infantry gained reassurance from anti-tank weapons sighted to ambush at short ranges, and from the knowledge that mobile reserves remained uncommitted in the sector. Reports from Luftflotte, Forda Army Group South, stressed that bridge interdiction was producing measurable delays but not closure. A stronger effect would require simultaneous damage at multiple access points and prolonged disruption of repair units. On May 18th, during morning staff conferences, Soviet front headquarters reviewed updated plots. Gains were verified, German counterattacks remained localized. Bridge throughput was at ceiling, but holding. Orders prioritized momentum toward Balaklia and directed engineers to reinforce bridge guards and camouflage procedures. The same morning, south of the Donets Neck, German mobile corps completed night moves into assembly woods. March tables indicated separate axes converging north and northeast toward the rear of the Soviet forward echelons, with infantry and anti-tank screens to protect the flanks of the advancing columns. Radio silence and limited courier traffic preserved operational security. The first contact with mobile German elements occurred along secondary roads southeast of Barvinkov. Soviet security detachments reported armor engines heard before dawn and dust plumes after sunrise along routes previously quiet during the offensive's first week. Local Soviet commanders requested artillery interdiction on suspected approach roads, but firing units were already tasked with supporting ongoing assaults toward Balaklia. Air reconnaissance was dispatched, yet low ceiling intervals limited visual confirmation. Forward reports still reflected the previous pattern, German infantry yielding ground near Balaklia, while messages from the salient's base described growing pressure on outposts screening the bridges. As the day advanced, divisional headquarters inside the salient reported a rise in contacts with mobile German units at the rear edges of their corridors. Short counterattacks probed supply points and attempted to cut telephone lines. Soviet staffs began rerouting ammunition columns and ordered additional security for medical evacuation convoys. Within German formations, logs recorded the capture of road junctions and the overrunning of small depots, with instructions to avoid extended engagements that could fix the mobile corps before the envelopment geometry was achieved. By the evening of May 18th, the early engagements phase had produced an operational inflection. North of Kharkov, Soviet spearheads remained engaged against German defenses near the city, with progress measured and contested. Inside the salient, forward units still advanced on Balaklia, yet communications to the rear showed signs of strain. South of the neck, German mobile formations moved beyond screening lines and began to press toward designated meeting points behind the Soviet forward echelons. The operational picture no longer consisted solely of linear fronts. It now included intersecting movements that would test whether supply across limited crossings could sustain attack, while also securing retreat routes if required. During night 18 to 19 May, orders and counter-orders multiplied. Soviet headquarters reaffirmed objectives toward Balaklia and instructed the holding of key villages along the corridors. Engineer units were told to prepare additional ferry sites and to stock repair materials near the bridges. German commands synchronized march columns for early light, assigning anti-aircraft protection to bridge seizure detachments and directing infantry to maintain pressure along the northern arc to prevent Soviet withdrawal without interference. The first engagements had shifted from village fighting to the opening of a maneuver aimed at the salient's base. Subsequent hours would reveal whether the offensive axes could be maintained while a converging blow developed in their rear. In the early hours of May 19th, the counterstroke from the south took clearer form. Mobile formations advancing under 1st Panzer Army moved north from the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk area toward the neck of the salient, using screened routes that bypassed earlier Soviet artillery registration points. Reconnaissance units probed crossroads southeast of Barvinkov, while columns with anti-tank screens aimed for road nodes feeding the bridges over the Donets. At the same time, elements of 6th Army began limited attacks from the north to press the shoulders of the Soviet corridors leading to Balaklia. The intention was to convert localized pressure into a converging movement that would intersect behind the Soviet forward echelons. Requests from Soviet divisional headquarters inside the salient for permission to pivot forces to the base accumulated during the morning. Front headquarters recorded these reports alongside maps that still showed gains toward Balaklia. Communications logs indicate that until late on May 19th, directives prioritized continuation of the offensive and holding of captured villages, with cautionary notes to strengthen flank security, when authorization to pull back and reinforce the neck was issued later that day. Formations already engaged near Balaklia required time to disengage and reorient. The limited number of lateral roads, clogged by supply traffic and medical evacuation, slowed these maneuvers. Air operations intensified along the Donets bridges. Luftwaffe sorties targeted access roads and camouflage parks east of Izium, attempting to synchronize bomb runs with peak traffic windows deduced from reconnaissance photographs. VVS fighters escorted bridge traffic and conducted ground attack missions against columns reported south of the salient's base. Loss reports for 19 to 20 May on both sides reflect higher sortie counts, with aircraft written off or damaged primarily by anti-aircraft fire near crossings and road nodes. Despite attacks, engineers kept at least one main crossing open at any given time, but intervals between convoys increased and queues lengthened on both banks. By 20th May, converging German movements compressed the Soviet security belt at the neck. Outpost companies reported armor-supported probes against villages controlling the road approaches to the bridges. Soviet staffs diverted artillery intended for Balaklia to interdiction fires against the advancing columns, while tank brigades were repositioned to cover likely junctions. Fuel and ammunition consumption rose as units shuttled between Axis support and rear area defense. Reports from the northern pincer, east and northeast of Kharkov, indicated continued pressure against German defenses, but no rapid breakthrough capable of forcing the German high command to redirect the mobile corps away from the neck. Strength figures at this stage show the scale of the developing crisis. Inside and around the salient, Soviet rifle and tank formations engaged in the offensive and its support numbered in the hundreds of thousands when counting the Southwestern Front's 6th and 57th Armies and attached corps. Contemporary estimates for forces west of the Donets during May, 18th to 21st, vary, with ranges indicating on the order of 150,000 to 200,000 personnel committed forward of the river. Opposing them, German 1st Panzer Army and elements of 6th Army deployed multiple panzer and motorized divisions with supporting infantry. Combined troop counts in the sector for Army Group South reached into the hundreds of thousands as well, though panzer-ready combat strength was concentrated in a smaller number of divisions. These comparative figures framed the operational stakes. A large Soviet grouping depended on a narrow throughput over the Donets, while German mobility concentrated at decisive points. Terrain continued to dictate tactics. Marshy lowlands and river meanders forced attacking columns onto established causeways. Inside the salient, repeated traffic degraded road surfaces despite drier weather, producing bottlenecks where recovery vehicles had to pull disabled trucks aside. German counterstroke routes ran along firm ground south and southeast of the bridges, allowing rapid advances once defensive screens were pushed back. Night movement favored the German columns protected by local anti-aircraft assets, while Soviet attempts to reposition at night competed with rear-area convoys heading to the bridges. Civilians near the neck experienced abrupt changes. Villages that had served as rear-area depots the week before now fell within artillery range. Medical stations evacuated under pressure. Wounded moved east across the bridges as priority loads, further reducing available capacity for ammunition. Reports from field hospitals mention shortages of blood plasma and bandages linked to convoy delays. German security units recorded the seizure of carts and horses to clear roads and carry ammunition forward to anti-tank screens. Soviet rear services instituted stricter movement controls to separate westbound and eastbound traffic, but single-lane sections at bridge approaches limited the effect. From 20th to 21st May, the German envelopment geometry approached closure. Contact reports from Soviet regiments guarding the neck described repeated engagements with armor spearheads attempting to link north and northeast behind the forward echelons. Artillery fire missions shifted to counter-battery, and interdiction of suspected assembly points in woods and behind ridgelines. Several Soviet tank brigades conducted counterattacks at crossroads to disrupt timing tables, recording short-lived successes that delayed individual columns, but did not prevent the broader convergence. Air reports noted transient local air superiority over the bridges when fighter sweeps arrived on time, followed by renewed Luftwaffe pressure when escorts departed for refueling. On 21st May, Soviet front headquarters issued orders for controlled withdrawal from advanced positions toward interim lines that would shorten supply distance and reduce exposure of the corridors. Implementation varied by sector. Units close to WWII required rearguard actions to disengage. Others on the corridor flanks drew back to ridge lines suitable for defense. The time lag between orders and execution allowed German mobile units to seize additional junctions. Telephone lines were cut and radio nets became congested, complicating coordination for the withdrawal and for the continued protection of the bridges. By 22nd May, the converging German columns had cut several roads feeding the bridges, and reports from bridge guards recorded direct fire on access routes. Soviet engineers attempted to open auxiliary ferries north of the main sites to split traffic, but throughput at these ad hoc points was significantly lower. Ammunition allotments for corps artillery were recalculated to prioritize defensive fires at the neck over support to the WWII thrust. Medical evacuation criteria tightened to prioritize ambulatory wounded who could move with minimal transport. Fuel stocks west of the river fell as convoys were rerouted or delayed. Several tank brigades reported immobilized vehicles awaiting gasoline or repair teams. Force disposition charts for 22nd to 23rd May show a shift in weight. The northern pincer reduced its offensive pressure and took up positions to block possible German exploitation toward the Ostgall. Inside the salient, a mix of rifle divisions, tank brigades, and artillery regiments formed successive defensive lines covering attempted withdrawals. German formations, having achieved partial closure, sought to tighten their hold on the neck while avoiding prolonged frontal assaults against prepared positions. Luftwaffe and VVS activity remained focused on bridges, ferry points, and road nodes. Bomb damage to approaches demanded constant engineer repairs. During these days, commanders' fates intersected with the operational crisis. Army and Corps headquarters moved frequently to avoid air attack and to maintain contact with formations under stress. Reports note the loss of several senior staff officers in strikes on command posts and columns. The deaths and captures that would later be associated with this operation began to appear in casualty lists and situation summaries, though full accounting was not yet possible while fighting continued. Front headquarters emphasized the need to preserve command cohesion for any breakout or further withdrawal east of the Donets. By the evening of 23rd May, the escalation phase had set the conditions for the next stage. The Soviet grouping west of the Donets faced a constricted supply and withdrawal path, with portions already severed. The German counterstroke, designed to remove the salient before the wider summer campaign, had produced a partial encirclement geometry centered on the bridge approaches and rear corridors. Orders on both sides reflected these realities. The Red Army prepared for a breakout attempt, or a phased withdrawal under fire. The Wehrmacht allocated forces to seal gaps and to block crossings. The crisis, defined by timing and throughput over a handful of routes, would now transition to larger engagements around the closing arcs and the final defense of the river exits. On 23 May, contact reports from screening battalions along the Barvinkov-Lozova axis confirmed that mobile German columns had reached road nodes controlling access to the Donets crossings. Map coordinates in divisional logs placed armored spearheads on lines north of Petropavlivka and east of Savinci, with infantry and anti-tank screens extending toward fields that covered the bridge approaches. Soviet front headquarters ordered the creation of successive defensive echelons inside the salient. Rifle divisions formed lines on ridgelines and river bends. Tank brigades were assigned to counterattack at junctions, where converging columns threatened to isolate corridors. Corps artillery shifted to interdiction of assembly woods and road forks. Communications officers rerouted field telephone trunks through redundant paths, but repeated cuts forced heavier reliance on radio and runners. The largest engagements began on 24th to 25th May, when attempts to hold the neck coincided with efforts to pull formations from the Balaklia axis. Units that had advanced on the rail spurs now received orders to disengage under fire and to march east on limited roads already congested with rear services. Rear traffic control introduced one-way schedules by hour, alternating eastbound and westbound flows, but march columns overlapped at villages where single-lane sections and damaged culverts forced halts. Fuel convoys prioritized tank brigades assigned to corridor defense. Ammunition columns were redirected from offensive allocations to anti-armor and counter-battery rounds. Air operations reached peak density over the Donets and the approaches to Barvinkov. Luftwaffe bombers attacked bridges and access roads in sequences designed to delay repair teams. Fighters strafed traffic caught at halts. VVS fighters and ground attack aircraft concentrated on disrupting road movement of German mobile units and on protecting river traffic during designated windows. Loss figures and daily summaries increased relative to the first week, with aircraft damaged by flak near bridges and by fighters intercepting over the corridors. Despite repeated strikes, engineers kept crossings serviceable through rapid patching and the use of spare pontoons, though throughput per hour fell as intervals between convoys increased to manage cratering and debris. Ground fighting around corridor villages took the form of repeated attacks and counterattacks at short range. Soviet rifle regiments organized strong points around schools, mills, and rail embankments. Anti-tank rifles and guns were sighted along streets to cover intersections. Tank brigades launched company-sized thrusts to push back German vanguards from road forks and to reopen block segments. German units responded with combined arms probes. Panzers advanced behind artillery and mortar fires. Infantry cleared houses and hedgerows. And anti-tank guns were towed forward to consolidate captured junctions. Company logs on both sides recorded engagements measured in hundreds of meters, with positions changing hands multiple times during a day. North of Kharkov, attacks from the Soviet northern pincer declined in strength as formations were tasked to screen against possible German exploitation toward the Oskol. German forces maintained pressure to fix these armies and to prevent the diversion of significant reserves to the salient's neck. Rail movements behind German lines indicated continued flexibility. Trains delivered fuel and ammunition to sidings, supporting the counterstroke, while maintaining stocks for defensive operations around Kharkov. Soviet rail repair battalions east of the Donets kept supply moving to forward dumps, but the transfer across the river depended on windows of relative air quiet. Command posts moved frequently to maintain contact. Several front and army-level headquarters displaced multiple times in a 24-hour period to avoid artillery and air attack, and to remain near the most threatened sectors. This tempo introduced delays in issuing and acknowledging orders. Radio nets became congested, and some regiments reported receiving parallel instructions that required clarification. Staff officers coordinated liaison parties to ensure that withdrawal phases, counterattack timings, and convoy schedules did not conflict. Medical services established relay points to move wounded east by stages when vehicles could not travel directly to bridges under fire. Civilian populations in corridor settlements experienced rapid changes as lines shifted. Evacuations took place under indirect fire. Households moved to cellars near wells and rail sidings. Requisition lists increased as both sides secured carts, horses, and tools for road work. Field gendarmerie and military police on both sides enforced movement controls to keep routes clear for combat units. Violations and detentions appear in logs as traffic density rose. Reports of casualties among civilians from mines and shelling were recorded by medical teams and staff civil affairs officers, though comprehensive figures were not assembled while fighting continued. By 25th May evening, the geometry of the envelopment had narrowed the usable exits to a few kilometers of road under continuous observation. Soviet attempts to widen the neck through local counterattacks achieved short-term openings, but could not create sustained depth for mass withdrawal. Fuel shortages affected units assigned to repeated counterattacks. Several brigades noted immobilized tanks awaiting resupply or recovery under enemy fire. Artillery ammunition allocations for defensive fires were rationed by hour, with priority to counter-battery tasks, when German guns registered new positions close enough to interdict the bridge approaches directly. German units pursued a methodical tightening of the ring, avoiding deep thrusts that might overextend in the face of counterattacks from multiple directions. Reconnaissance reported Soviet concentrations preparing for breakout attempts. Artillery registered likely assembly areas and routes leading to the Donets. Panzer battalions rotated forward companies to maintain pressure, while preserving operational vehicles. Maintenance sections worked near front lines to return damaged machines to service within hours. Infantry units expanded anti-tank obstacles along expected approach lanes and emplaced additional guns at short range in village streets and orchard edges. On 26th May, orders inside the pocket formalized preparations for coordinated breakout attempts. Timetables synchronized night assembly, short artillery concentrations on blocking positions, and tank-led thrusts aimed at specific junctions. Infantry were to follow closely to hold road segments long enough for successive echelons to pass. Engineer detachments prepared bridging materials for emergency river crossings at secondary sites if the main bridges became unusable. Signals plans included prearranged code groups to report capture of waypoints and to request artillery lifts. The plan required precise timing and sustained traffic control under fire to move formations by regiment and brigade. Breakout attempts encountered layered defenses. Initial thrusts often penetrated the first line of roadblocks and anti-tank positions, but follow-on echelons met fire from guns sighted in depth and from panzers counterattacking from covered ovals. Where Soviet tanks broke through to road forks, reports note brief openings, during which columns advanced several kilometers before renewed blocking actions forced halts. Artillery support from within the pocket was constrained by ammunition levels and by the need to conserve for subsequent attempts. Counter-battery duels continued, with each side seeking to disrupt the other's coordination at critical junctures. Simultaneously, German formations pressed from multiple directions to reduce the space available for assembly and maneuver. Infantry advanced to occupy ridge lines controlling the corridors. Anti-aircraft units accompanied columns to contest low-level WWII attacks on road convoys. Luftwaffe sorties increased over potential breakout axes at dawn and dusk, targeting road junctions and column heads. VVS fighters attempted to keep these windows open. Ground attack flights struck blocking positions with rockets and cannon, reporting localized successes when weather and timing aligned. Command and control under these conditions produced uneven results across sectors. Some units executed planned night moves and reached designated start lines at the allocated times. Others were delayed by road congestion, damage, or misdirected traffic. Telephone lines could not be maintained in forward zones under continuous movement. Radio sets operated at high load, and net discipline varied under stress. Staff efforts concentrated on sequencing, ensuring that counterattacks supporting breakouts did not collide with units withdrawing from other axes. By the evening of 26 May, the peak phase had absorbed significant resources from both sides. Within the pocket, ammunition stocks for artillery and heavy mortars were reduced. Fuel reserves fluctuated by unit, depending on resupply success. German mobile formations reported rising maintenance demands and noted reduced operational tank counts after repeated engagements and long marches, though recovery kept a proportion, returning to service daily. The spatial configuration of the battlefield had compressed into a limited number of viable routes to the Donets, each under observation and subject to interdiction. The next decisions focused on whether to commit remaining reserves to one concentrated breakout axis or to continue multiple attempts in parallel to complicate German blocking efforts with timelines governed by the condition of the bridges, the availability of fuel, and the endurance of units assigned to hold the corridors under continuous attack. Night 26th to 27th, May brought a change in Soviet methods inside the pocket. Instead of simultaneous thrusts on several axes, staff orders concentrated remaining fuel and artillery ammunition on two principal corridors, with diversionary probes elsewhere to hold German blocking forces in place. Rifle divisions reorganized into march groups with assault echelons up front and baggage reduced to essentials. Non-essential vehicles were abandoned to clear road space for tanks and artillery tractors. Engineers pre-positioned assault boats and rope ferries near river bends north of the main bridges to enable small unit crossings if a temporary opening appeared on the far bank. Signal units issued simplified code groups to report capture of intermediate waypoints and to request short, high-density fire concentrations. German units adapted by reinforcing depth rather than frontage. Blocking positions were layered. Anti-tank guns at short range in defiles and village streets. Mobile reserves placed behind woods with covered exit routes. And minefields reseeded at night, on lanes, already swept earlier in the day. Reconnaissance aircraft conducted repeated passes to detect assembly activity. Artillery registered on likely roadheads and orchard edges, where columns typically paused to reorganize before renewed attempts. March tables assigned specific panzer companies to counterattack duty by hour to maintain an uninterrupted response without exhausting single units. Logistics moved forward maintenance teams with spares and fuel to keep operational counts stable. On 27th May at first light, coordinated breakout efforts went in along both designated corridors. Short artillery concentrations suppressed identified gun pits and roadblocks. Tank brigades advanced in wedge formations with sappers riding on the hulls to clear obstacles. Infantry followed at close distance to occupy intersections and hold flanks. Initial gains were recorded on both axes. Company logs note several road junctions retaken and traffic flowing east for limited intervals. German countermeasures restored blocking lines within hours, using panzers to strike the head and flanks of the advancing columns, while infantry re-established anti-tank screens. Where openings persisted briefly, divisional reports show hundreds of vehicles moving before renewed fire-forced halts. Air support on 27th May reflected the focus on breakouts. VS ground attack flights struck identified gun lines and vehicle clusters behind German positions, while fighter sweeps attempted to hold airspace over the corridors during the hours of maximum movement. Luftwaffe sorties concentrated on the same axes, contesting the airspace and attacking column heads when fighters achieved local advantage. Loss summaries indicate a rise in aircraft damaged near treetop height, consistent with the density of low-level operations over limited terrain. Both sides reported ammunition shortages for specific bomb types and rockets late in the day, evidence of sustained tempo. Inside the pocket, adaptation became increasingly pragmatic. Medical services established forward aid stations at intervals along the corridors to shorten evacuation cycles, using hand carts when trucks could not pass. Recovery teams concentrated on removing disabled vehicles from single-lane segments. Where towing was impossible, vehicles were pushed off the road and abandoned. Fuel discipline tightened. Tank units received allotments for specific mission distances, and rear echelons consolidated remaining gasoline into fewer, better protected tankers. Infantry redistributed small arms ammunition from units not scheduled for immediate assault to those at the corridor heads. German formations also managed fatigue and losses by rotation. Company and battalion-level logs record scheduled reliefs from roadblocks to nearby reserve positions for rest and maintenance, followed by return to the line before dusk, when Soviet columns typically attempted renewed pushes. Infantry engineers expanded anti-vehicle ditches and reinforced roadblocks with felled trees and rubble drawn from damaged buildings. Where Soviet artillery disrupted a blocking point, pre-planned fallback lines at the next bend or embankment absorbed the thrust, buying time for mobile reserves to counterattack. Coordination between artillery and forward observers improved with the use of wired observation posts in houses that had line of sight to the main roads. Reports from formations still outside the pocket, north and northeast of Kharkov, note continued German pressure to fix their positions. These armies reduced attempts to attack and focused on blocking lines eastward to receive potential breakout groups. Rail traffic east of the Donets moved ammunition and replacements to the far bank, but bridging into the pocket remained constrained by air and artillery interdiction. Signals traffic shows increased liaison between units inside and outside the encirclement to synchronize breakout timings with potential relief actions, though distance and German control of intermediate ground limited direct coordination. By 27th May evening, the cumulative effect of repeated breakouts and counterattacks manifested in equipment status. Several Soviet tank brigades reported operational counts below half of initial strength due to combat losses, mechanical failures, and fuel shortages. Artillery units conserved shells for counter-battery and for short concentrations at the moment of movement. Rifle regiments reported reduced numbers, but maintained unit structures to preserve command continuity. German panzer battalions recorded reduced operational tanks after repeated short, high-intensity engagements and long hours underway, compensating by focusing on decisive points and by increasing reliance on anti-tank guns for static defense. On May 28th, the pattern repeated with narrower options. The southern corridor saw a pre-dawn attempt with artillery lifts timed to the minute. Forward companies penetrated the first two blocking lines and reached a village controlling a key fork toward the river. For a brief period, road signs were changed to orient traffic, and echelons moved east in close order. A counterattack by panzers from concealed ovals, supported by direct-fire artillery from a rail embankment, cut the route. Subsequent attempts shifted a few kilometers north, where fields allowed some dispersion, but minefields relayed overnight and concentrated fire from short-range guns halted the advance again. The northern corridor experienced similar outcomes, brief openings followed by closure as German reserves struck flanks and severed telephone lines. Civilian movement intersected with military traffic. Villagers displaced by the shifting front attempted to reach the river using footpaths, adding complexity to route control. Military police organized lanes for non-combatants during designated windows to reduce interference with convoys, but the density of movement made separation incomplete. Reports note the establishment of temporary collection points east of the river, where civilians arriving by boat or improvised ferries receive basic assistance before being directed away from bridge approaches. Command and staff losses increased as headquarters moved under fire. Several corps and division leaders were reported missing or killed during relocations or while visiting forward units. The deaths and captures among senior officers complicated coordination for subsequent breaks. Replacement of key staff roles occurred at short notice, and liaison teams expanded to ensure that orders reached regiments during periods when radios were jammed or nets saturated. On the German side, regimental and battalion commanders were rotated forward to sustain control at blocking points, with some recorded as casualties in close-range engagements where command posts were within artillery range. By the end of 28th May, resistance and adaptation had delayed, but not reversed the encirclement. The available space for assembly within the pocket had contracted, compressing routes and increasing the risk of artillery concentrations. Fuel reserves were unevenly distributed. Certain battalions retained enough to attempt one more full-scale push, while others reported only minimal mobility. Ammunition stocks for heavy weapons were rationed to the most critical hours. German formations, though experiencing wear, maintained cohesion in the layered defense and preserved enough mobile strength to counterstrike when gaps appeared. Planning for 29th May reflected these constraints. Soviet orders called for one concentrated attempt along the axis that had achieved the greatest temporary depth on the previous day, supported by diversionary attacks and intensive counter-battery fire. Engineers were assigned to breach newly detected mine belts and to mark lanes with visible indicators for night movement. Units outside the pocket synchronized artillery demonstrations on the far bank to distract and to interdict German reserves. German orders emphasized holding current blocking lines, reinforcing anti-tank belts with additional guns at short range, and preparing to meet a concentrated push with coordinated tank and artillery fire. Both sides acknowledged that the operational situation would likely be decided within the next 24 to 48 hours by the success or failure of these final efforts, governed by remaining fuel, ammunition, and the capacity to keep routes open under continuous pressure. At dawn on 29th May, the operational balance hinged on a limited number of road forks and bridge approaches north and northeast of Barvinkov. Inside the pocket, orders concentrated remaining fuel and artillery ammunition on one principal axis, with secondary probes to keep German roadblocks occupied. Outside the pocket, formations east of the Donets prepared artillery demonstrations to distract and to interdict German reserves moving to reinforce the neck. Signals plans reduced messages to prearranged code groups to avoid congestion on crowded radio nets. Engineers marked lanes through new mine belts with boards and fabric strips visible at night, accepting the risk that markers might also aid defenders once detected. The first assault companies moved at first light under short, dense fire concentrations. Tank brigades advanced with sappers, clearing obstacles under direct fire. Rifle battalions followed close to occupy intersections. Initial reports logged the capture of several blocking points and the reopening of a segment leading toward the river. Traffic control switched signs and posted guides at turns to accelerate flow. For a short interval, vehicles and marching troops moved east in close order. Counterattacks arrived from covered ovals behind woods, with panzers striking the head and flanks of the column, while artillery fired over open sights from embankments and building corners. Telephone lines were severed. Radio messages reported loss of the fork and requested renewed concentrations. The opening closed and movement halted at the next bend. German dispositions reflected layered depth. Anti-tank guns at short range covered straight stretches. Mobile reserves sat behind alternate defiles. Minefields were reseated on lanes cleared hours earlier. Air reconnaissance circled to detect massing signs. Artillery registered on orchard edges and track junctions, typically used for reorganization. Panzer companies rotated by schedule to keep a ready force at each likely contact point without exhausting single battalions. Maintenance teams operated near the front with spares and fuel to return vehicles to service quickly. Logs note ammunition redistribution among blocking detachments during pauses between attacks. In parallel, the northern corridor saw a pre-planned push, supported by counter-battery fire from within the pocket and interdiction chutes from east of the Donets. The pattern repeated: penetration through the first line, brief traffic flow, flank counterstrike, and closure. Where infantry reached a village controlling a road fork, houses changed hands several times within hours. Casualty clearing stations set up in cellars treated wounded from both sides as control shifted. Civilians sheltering near wells and sidings were moved by military police into designated lanes during low traffic windows. Reports list incidents where non-combatant movement intersected with convoys despite controls. Command cohesion was tested by losses among senior staff. During relocations between forward command posts and liaison visits to corridor heads, several corps and division leaders were reported killed or missing. Replacement officers assumed roles at short notice. Liaison teams expanded to ensure that orders reached regiments when radio nets saturated. On the German side, battalion and regimental commanders were rotated forward to maintain control at roadblocks. Some became casualties as headquarters positions moved within range of direct fire and air attack. Despite attrition, both command systems continued to function, relying on simplified orders and prearranged timings. By midday on May 29th, fuel status determined options. Tank brigades slated for continued attempts reported allocations sized for one assault and limited repositioning. Immobilized vehicles were cannibalized to keep a smaller operational pool moving. Artillery ammunition plans prioritized counter-battery, and brief concentrations timed to crossings at key bends. Rifle regiments restructured march groups to reduce baggage and to maximize the number of armed personnel at the column heads. German units reported rising maintenance loads and reductions in operational tank counts after repeated short actions. They compensated by tightening the anti-tank belt and increasing reliance on guns in static positions while keeping mobile elements for decisive counterstrokes. Evidence from captured maps and German situation overlays confirms the geometrical closure of the encirclement by the last days of May. The ring did not constitute a solid wall at all points. Spacing and relief in the field allowed local penetrations. However, depth at critical forks and the ability to counterstrike quickly from covered positions created a functional blockade against sustained passage of large formations. Soviet staffs recorded that auxiliary ferries upstream of the main bridges offered limited throughput for small groups. Attempts to exploit these routes for unit-scale crossings encountered artillery registration and air attack on approaches observable from ridgelines west of the river. Orders within the pocket shifted to preserving command cohesion and enabling segmented withdrawals where feasible. Formations were instructed to break into group size to match road capacity and fuel, to move at prearranged hours, and to avoid uncoordinated rushes that would clog single-lane sections. Engineers prepared demolitions for equipment that could not be recovered to prevent capture. Signals arranged code groups to confirm passage of waypoints and to trigger artillery lifts from east of the river when groups approached designated bends. Medical services triaged cases to prioritize those able to move with minimal transport. Accounts from German formations emphasize the need to avoid deep pursuit beyond prepared lines. Company logs describe holding fire until the head of a column entered the designated kill zone, then opening with coordinated gun, mortar, and tank fire to sever the formation and isolate lead elements from their support. When forward Soviet units reached ground behind the first blocking position, pre-planned fallback lines absorbed the thrust, and counterattacks from adjacent sectors restored the blockade. Reports from Luftflotte, 4 document attacks on column heads and bridge approaches at hours, predicted from reconnaissance photos of traffic density, and from observation posts with line of sight to access roads. Within this phase, the fates of senior commanders intersected with the battlefield geometry. During attempts to break out from the southern and eastern arcs of the pocket, Army and Corps-level headquarters repeatedly displaced under fire. Contemporary records and later compilations place the death of General Fyodor Kostenko during this period, while moving with forward elements near the shrinking exit corridors. Multiple sources indicate late May dates on the Barvinkov approaches. General Andrei Gorodnyansky appears in German capture and interrogation lists after unsuccessful breakout attempts toward the Donets. Documents associate his capture with the final days of May, as the pocket contracted. These outcomes reflected the risk to command posts operating inside a reduced maneuver space under continuous air and artillery observation. Stavka directives issued in the second half of May shaped the timing of the transition from attack to withdrawal. Orders forbidding retreat earlier in the month were relaxed around May 19th, authorizing controlled reorientation. However, the time required to disengage from the Balaklia axis and the evolving situation at the neck compressed the window for orderly movement. German counterstroke timing exploited this lag. On maps from both sides, the moment when mobile corps from the south reached junctions behind the Soviet forward echelons marks the operational turning point. The salient ceased to be a springboard and became a compartment requiring breakout under fire. By nightfall on May 29th, remaining options narrowed further. Inside the pocket, groups prepared for renewed attempts at first light with reduced artillery support and fewer operational tanks. East of the river, artillery demonstrations and interdiction fires continued to restrict German reinforcement movement, but could not reopen the principal bridges for sustained troop passage. German orders for May 30th emphasized conserving armor for counterstrikes at the most likely axes and reinforcing short-range anti-tank belts in village streets and along rail embankments. Both sides recognized that subsequent hours would determine whether organized groups could cross or whether remaining formations would fragment under pressure, leaving pockets of resistance to be reduced in sequence. The turning point of the campaign around Kharkov in May 1942 thus consisted of interlocking decisions and timings: Soviet commitment forward of the Donets without fully broadening corridors, German choice to trade ground near the city while assembling mobile forces for a blow at the neck, command directives that fixed or freed movement windows, and the physical limits of river crossings under air and artillery observation. The immediate military result by 29th to 30th May was a functional encirclement, persistent local penetrations notwithstanding. The broader consequences for subsequent operations in the southern theater would follow from how many personnel and how much equipment could still be extracted across the river during the final attempts scheduled for the end of May and the first days of June, under conditions of diminishing fuel, reduced artillery stocks, and continuous interdiction at every approach to the waterline. On May 30 to 31, remaining formations inside the pocket attempted final passages to the Donets under compressed schedules. March groups moved by regiment and brigade along predetermined lanes, with engineers marking gaps under fire. Artillery support from east of the river timed short concentrations to coincide with column heads reaching designated bends. Where lanes opened, small groups crossed by boat or improvised ferries at secondary sites, while heavier equipment required the main bridges, which were under observation and periodic air attack. Reports from bridge guards list cycles of closure and reopening throughout the day, governed by crater repair and debris clearance. Rear services burned or demolished stocks that could not be evacuated to prevent capture. German blocking lines advanced in increments to reduce assembly space. Infantry occupied ridge lines overlooking approach roads. Anti-tank guns and mortars covered straight stretches. Panzer companies counterattacked when columns broke through. Where Soviet units reached the riverbank without bridging capacity, small detachments attempted swims or raft crossings at night. Captured documents and later compilations place organized crossings still occurring into 31st May and 1st June, but in decreasing scale as fuel and ammunition fell. Engineer notes east of the river record final demolition of serviceable pontoons after the decision to prevent further crossings to avoid enemy use. Surrender and capture occurred in stages. Company and battalion-level clusters fought to exhaustion at village strongpoints and rail embankments. When ammunition was expended and further movement blocked, groups laid down arms after negotiations or were overrun. German regimental logs for the last days of May and early June describe processing of prisoners at road forks, with immediate sorting by rank and branch before transfer to collection points. Columns moved under guard toward assembly camps established west of the river. Medical cases were stabilized at field stations before evacuation by truck or rail. Contemporary German claims and subsequent research provide ranges for prisoners taken in the operation that align with overall Soviet losses reported for the southwestern and southern front formations engaged. Withdrawal east of the river concluded with demolition of crossing equipment and occupation of defensive lines along the Donets and Oskol. Units that escaped retained partial structures but recorded losses in heavy weapons and vehicles. Staffs compiled lists of missing and confirmed captured personnel as reports arrived from stragglers and liaison parties. Ammunition and fuel stocks east of the river were redistributed to reconstitute formations for defense. Replacement cadres began to arrive by rail in early June, and depots allocated small arms and machine guns to refill battalion tables where possible. Comparative casualty summaries assembled in June show the scale of the immediate outcome. On the Soviet side, estimates for personnel lost in the operation, including killed, wounded, missing, and captured, range approximately 170,000 to 240,000 for the armies committed west of the Donets and supporting formations. Equipment losses included hundreds of tanks, large numbers of field guns and mortars, and vehicles abandoned or destroyed during breakout attempts. German records for Army Group South in the Kharkov sector During the May fighting list, casualties in the tens of thousands, commonly cited in the low to mid-five figures, with panzer divisions reporting reduced operational counts after repeated engagements. The asymmetry reflected the encirclement geometry, a large grouping constrained by river crossings versus mobile forces able to strike at the neck and to interdict withdrawal. Command outcomes became fully known as lists were reconciled. Reports confirmed the death of General Fyodor Kostenko during movements near the contracted exit corridors in the final days of May. General Andrei Gorodnyansky appears in capture records following unsuccessful breakout attempts. Interrogation summaries associated him with command elements taken near the Donets approaches. Additional corps and division commanders were reported killed or missing in actions, tied to relocations between forward command posts, or during attempts to regroup under air and artillery observation. These outcomes affected subsequent reorganization decisions at the front level in June. Civilian conditions reflected the rapid shift from rear areas to combat zones and back. Populations in corridor settlements experienced evacuations during bombardment, requisitioning of carts and animals, and casualties from mines and shelling. After the fighting passed, German field administrations organized burial parties, cleared roads, and re-established movement controls. Medical teams documented treatment of local wounded alongside prisoners and soldiers. East of the river, Soviet authorities set up collection points for returning civilians and soldiers who had crossed independently. Efforts focused on demining access paths, restoring wells, and repairing basic infrastructure. Material recovery and denial operations followed immediately. German engineers cataloged captured equipment, gathered serviceable tanks and guns for repair, and destroyed items that could not be moved. Ammunition dumps were secured. Fuel captured was allocated to mobile formations preparing for further operations. Rail troops repaired damaged sidings and bridges leading toward Kharkov and the Donbass approaches. On the Soviet side, engineer and NKPS teams restored East Bank rail function, while military workshops worked to bring damaged vehicles back to service. The Donets line received new field fortifications, with anti-tank ditches and mine belts laid to deter immediate exploitation. Intelligence exploitation proceeded in parallel. German staffs examined captured maps, orders, and radio logs to reconstruct the Soviet offensive plan, logistics schedules, and command relationships between the southwestern and southern fronts. Interrogations focused on bridge throughput, ammunition expenditure rates, and timing of Stavka directives that governed retreat authorization around May 19th. Soviet staffs collected accounts from units that escaped, identifying points where blocking lines were penetrated, timings of local air superiority, and delays caused by road damage or misdirection. These analyses informed adjustments to defensive planning on the East Bank and to future offensive procedures regarding corridor width and reserve allocation at river crossings. Air operations tapered as ground fighting ceased. Luftwaffe sorties shifted from bridge interdiction to reconnaissance and limited strikes against East Bank targets. VVS units reduced concentrations over the pocket and returned to interdiction missions against German railheads and road nodes, supporting movements south. Loss accounting in early June finalized aircraft written off and pilots missing, with both sides noting that low-level operations over constrained terrain had produced high damage rates relative to sortie counts. Supply lines on both sides reoriented within days. For the Wehrmacht, removal of the salient straightened the front and shortened defensive lines around Kharkov, allowing release of mobile formations and artillery for operations planned further south. Fuel and ammunition previously earmarked for the counterstroke against the salient could be redirected to preparations for the summer campaign. For the Red Army, stockpiles east of the Donets were redistributed to reconstituted units. Priority shifted to fortifying river lines, restoring rail capacity for lateral movements, and absorbing replacements to recover divisional structures. Administrative and legal processes followed capture and loss. German authorities recorded prisoner identities, separated officers for questioning, and organized train movements to rear camps. Medical reports note treatment of wounded prisoners in forward facilities before transfer. Soviet commands compiled casualty lists, issued missing in action notices, and initiated investigations into unit-level reporting accuracy, where gaps appeared due to loss of records during the encirclement. Awards and disciplinary actions were deferred pending comprehensive review, given the incomplete state of documentation immediately after the fighting. By the first week of June, the withdrawal and reduction phases had concluded. The Donets line east of Izium and Barvinkovy became the immediate front, with patrols and artillery duels replacing large-scale maneuver in this sector. The geographic features that had channeled the May operation, river crossings, limited causeways, and observation from ridgelines, remained central to defensive planning. The immediate consequences were thus defined. Formations west of the river that failed to break out were eliminated or captured. Those that crossed re-entered the order of battle with reduced equipment and personnel. German forces regained a continuous line and freed mobile units for the next phase. The broader implications for operational planning in the Southern Theater, including the allocation of mobile forces and the timing of subsequent offensives, would unfold in the following weeks as both commands assessed the outcome and adjusted doctrine, logistics, and command arrangements for the campaign scheduled for summer 1942. The operation's legacy lay first in force redistribution and calendar effects. With the Barvinkovo salient eliminated by the end of May, Army Group South restored a continuous front around Kharkov and released mobile formations for the summer plan. Rail repair and road clearance in early June enabled fuel and ammunition to flow toward assembly areas for the southward offensive. 6th Army, having defended Kharkov's approaches and participated in the encirclement, prepared to move east and southeast in support of operations scheduled for late June and July. 1st Panzer Army, after the counterstroke at the neck, reoriented logistics for deeper maneuvers toward the lower Don and beyond. The time saved by avoiding prolonged positional battles around Kharkov matched staff expectations for a pre-summer straightening of the line. On the Soviet side, the immediate result was the attrition and capture of a large grouping west of the Donets, and the loss of significant quantities of tanks, artillery, and transport. Estimates for personnel losses across the southwestern and southern front formations engaged cluster around 170,000 to 240,000, including prisoners, with equipment abandoned during repeated breakout attempts. Surviving units that crossed east retained skeletal structures, but required months to rebuild heavy weapons and vehicle parks. Stavka reallocated replacements, re-equipped rifle divisions with available small arms, and prioritized fortifying the Donets-Oskol line. Rail movements in June focused on bringing up ammunition, engineers, and anti-tank assets to restore defensive capacity, where the river and ridge lines offered observation and fields of fire. Doctrinal implications were recorded in staff studies, war diaries, and post-operation directives. Soviet analyses emphasized corridor width relative to depth, the need for redundant crossings and protected lateral roads inside any salient, and the permanent assignment of mobile reserves to the salient's base to counter expected strikes at the neck. Reports also addressed communications. Reliance on a few trunk lines and saturated radio nets complicated transitions from attack to withdrawal. German studies highlighted the efficacy of elastic defense near an objective city combined with concentration of armor against enemy supply necks, synchronization of air reconnaissance with interdiction at peak traffic windows, and the value of layered roadblocks with short-range anti-tank gun belts backed by limited but responsive panzer reserves. Command decisions remain central to assessments. On the Soviet side, the offensive concept, two converging efforts against Kharkov with main forces inside the salient, assumed that depth could be converted into breadth before the enemy assembled a counterstroke at the base. The delay in authorizing withdrawal until May 19th compressed the timeline for reorientation, once mobile German formations moved north behind the forward echelons. Timoshenko's execution of the plan, Bagramyan's staff management of phase lines and allocations, and Stavka's directives governing retreat all appear in operational records as co-determinants of the outcome, weighed differently by various investigators but documented in comparable terms. Timing of orders, bridge throughput, ammunition expenditure, and the balance between forward commitment and rear area security. On the German side, the choice to trade ground near Kharkov while building a counterstroke south of the Donets aligned local tactics with the wider intent to free forces for the summer campaign. Mobile corps timing, use of depth rather than broad contact lines, and consistent air reconnaissance over river crossings were decisive elements recorded in after-action summaries. Civilian experience enters the historical record through medical logs, field administration files, and local reports. Populations in villages along the corridors faced evacuations under bombardment, requisitioning of draft animals and carts, and mine hazards during and after the fighting. Post-battle administrations on the West Bank organized burial details, reopened roads, and collected abandoned equipment. East of the river, Soviet authorities set up collection points for returnees, demined approaches, and repaired wells and sidings. These activities affected labor and transport availability in June, linking the military aftermath to regional economic and social conditions. The fates of senior commanders became part of the operation's documentary backbone. Records compiled in June confirmed that General Fyodor Kostenko was killed during movements in the shrinking exit zone. Capture lists and interrogation summaries placed General Andrei Grodnyansky among officers taken near the Donets, approaches as the pocket contracted. These entries sit alongside losses of corps and division leaders on both sides, illustrating the exposure of command posts to air and artillery observation in a compressed maneuver space. Their inclusion in operational files anchors later narratives and contemporaneous documentation, rather than retrospective attribution. Material capture and denial shaped subsequent capabilities. German engineers cataloged and redistributed serviceable tanks, guns, and vehicles. Ammunition and fuel taken in depots were assigned to formations preparing for the next phase. Rail troops repaired sidings and bridges on lines feeding Kharkov and the Donbas approaches, restoring throughput for planned operations. Soviet workshops east of the river recovered damaged vehicles, while engineers built new field fortifications on the Donets line and laid mine belts and anti-tank ditches to deter immediate exploitation. These technical measures, logged in depot and engineer reports, trace how both sides translated the battle's end state into the logistics of what followed. In historiography, the operation is reconstructed from converging sources: Soviet front archives, German Army Group and Air Force records, aerial photographs of crossings and column densities, and post-war operational studies. Debates over responsibility compare intentions, decisions, and outcomes using equivalent factual standards. Whether the Soviet plan's initial gains toward Balaklia justified the risk at the salient's base, whether earlier withdrawal could have preserved larger forces, whether German success derived primarily from mobile concentration or from the pre-existing vulnerability of river-bound supply. The timeline, offensive start on May 12th, relaxation of retreat restrictions around May 19th, counterstroke at the neck in the third week, closure and reduction across 30 May to 1st June, provides the structure within which interpretations vary. Strategically, the elimination of the Barvenkovo salient simplified Army Group South's front and released mobile forces for the summer offensive toward the Lower Don and beyond. The Red Army's losses reduced near-term offensive capacity in this sector and required reconstitution before later operations. The episode thus functioned as a hinge between the winter counteroffensive and the mid-1942 campaigns, demonstrating how river crossings, limited causeways, and air-ground coordination could determine outcomes when large formations operated on constrained road nets. Commemoration and local memory marked the terrain, with cemeteries, monuments, and preserved positions, while archives preserved the operational core, bridges logged by span and load, march graphs of truck columns, ammunition ledgers, and signals diagrams. In this record, the disaster of May 1942 around Kharkov is less a single decisive blow than a sequence of interlocked decisions under measurable constraints. Offensive ambition met limits set by throughput across a few crossings. Defensive economy of force near a city combined with concentrated maneuver at a salient's base. Orders at the level of fronts intersected with the hour-by-hour condition of roads, pontoons, fuel, and nets. The historical significance lies in that interaction. It established the immediate conditions for the summer campaign of 1942 and provided both commands with data on timing, logistics, and command control that shaped their subsequent plans.